Live television promises authenticity, but sometimes that authenticity becomes something viewers wish they could unsee. In this video, we're uncovering 6 of the most horrifying live TV deaths ever broadcasted. Cameras kept rolling as tragedy unfolded. It was May 14th, 2014. The morning air at a small regional wildlife park in the Moravian Silesian region of the Czech Republic carried the familiar scent of hay and animal musk as staff prepared for what should have been a routine educational broadcast. Marek Dolezal, 41, had spent 12 years as a zookeeper before transitioning to television work 3 years earlier. His show, broadcast on local regional networks, focused on wildlife education with a personal touch that set him apart from polished nature documentaries. The zoo's insurance company had recently tightened restrictions on media access, specifically discouraging live broadcasts involving direct enclosure entry. But Marek's history as former staff allowed him special privileges that bypassed several newer safeguards. Large ungulates like the European bison require specialized handling protocols due to their unpredictable nature and massive size. Even experienced keepers maintain safe distances and never turn their backs on these powerful animals, whose territorial instincts can trigger sudden aggressive behavior without warning. Direct, unsupervised human presence inside an active bison enclosure is normally prohibited under modern zoo safety standards. That morning segment was designed to demonstrate proper visitor behavior around large hoofed animals. The production team had chosen the bison enclosure specifically because Marek had worked with this particular animal for years. The segment was airing live on a regional morning television program with no broadcast delay, as the production team followed Marek into the enclosure. However, recent budget cuts had reduced staffing, and the usual safety coordinator was absent. A second keeper assigned as a spotter had been pulled away to cover another enclosure, leaving Marek alone. Weather conditions were optimal, but the animal had been agitated earlier due to construction noise from nearby renovations that the zoo administration had failed to postpone. The plan called for Marek to enter the main enclosure alone, positioning himself near the primary gate while explaining safe observation techniques. The entry was a procedural violation that went unchallenged due to Marek's seniority and the pressure of a live broadcast schedule. However, maintenance workers had used the secondary service gate earlier that morning to deliver fresh bedding, and although the latch appeared engaged at a glance, debris prevented it from fully seating. Cameras rolled as Marek entered the enclosure. The 2,200-pound bison initially remained calm, grazing near the far wall while Marek explained proper body posture to viewers. Confident in his experience, he gradually moved closer to demonstrate how humans should position themselves to appear non-threatening. This approach contradicted the advice he was verbally giving, but it was subtle enough that no one intervened. As he spoke, Marek slowly backed toward what he believed was the secured secondary gate, unaware that it stood slightly ajar behind him. Without warning, the bison's demeanor shifted. The animal raised its massive head, snorted once, and charged directly at Marek with devastating speed. Live television viewers watched in horror as the 2,200-pound animal struck him squarely in the torso, ramming him backward with its head and chest, and driving his body through the partially open gate as it flexed inward. Marek hit the concrete service area hard, his legs twisted at unnatural angles. Momentum carried the bison partially into the threshold, where it pinned and trampled Marek with repeated crushing blows. The camera operator froze in shock as staff members screamed off camera. The live feed cut abruptly mid-scream as the broadcast director realized what was happening. On-site zoo emergency staff reached the scene within 90 seconds, using emergency protocols to drive the animal back into the enclosure and secure the gates. Paramedics arrived within 8 minutes, but Marek had already succumbed to his injuries. The coroner's report determined that Marek died from massive internal trauma, caused by multiple blunt force impacts. Marek's archived episodes were quietly removed from broadcast rotation, and his family received an undisclosed settlement from the zoo's insurance company. It was February 2nd, 2016. The Atlantic winds swept across the volcanic cliffs of a remote Canary Island overlook, with deceptive calm, carrying salt spray and the promise of an approaching storm system that would claim a life before evening. Elena Mariana Mendez, 29, had spent 3 years covering routine weather segments from the safety of studio green screens, desperately seeking opportunities to demonstrate her capabilities as a field correspondent. Her colleagues described her as determined, but inexperienced in dangerous field conditions, often volunteering for assignments others avoided to build her reputation. Coastal cliff reporting presents unique challenges, where sudden crosswind and downslope gusts can create unpredictable forces exceeding 60 miles per hour. Professional field reporters typically use safety harnesses and work with experienced crews who understand environmental hazards, but Elena's network operated on limited budgets with minimal safety protocols. That morning, Elena received an assignment to cover an approaching Atlantic storm system from one of the Canary Islands' exposed clifftop overlooks. The network scheduled the segment as a live field report, broadcast in real time from the clifftop as the storm approached. The segment was designed to showcase the raw power of approaching weather, with producers specifically requesting dramatic visuals of Elena reporting against strong winds. Meteorological services had issued wind advisories warning of gusts up to 70 miles per hour, but network executives pressured Elena to proceed, emphasizing the competitive advantage of live cliffside coverage despite escalating conditions. Elena arrived at the location wearing standard business attire and worn, smooth, leather-soled dress shoes, carrying only a handheld microphone and earpiece. The clifftop overlook had no safety barriers, just a narrow ledge of volcanic rock overlooking a 120-foot drop to jagged coastline below. Her cameraman expressed concerns about the deteriorating conditions, hesitating alongside her as gusts grew stronger, but both ultimately deferred after producers reiterated their instructions over the earpiece. As the live broadcast began, wind speeds were already approaching dangerous levels. Elena positioned herself within 6 feet of the cliff edge, struggling to maintain composure as gusts whipped her jacket and forced her to widen her stance for stability. Producers, monitoring from the studio, encouraged her to move closer to the edge for more dramatic footage, prompting visible hesitation from both Elena and the cameraman as conditions worsened. A sudden, violent crosswind gust struck the clifftop with devastating force. Elena staggered sideways, her microphone scraping against volcanic rock as she fought for balance. The live camera captured her losing footing on the uneven stone as she slipped toward the edge, followed by a sudden spike in audio distortion before the feed cut away. Acting quickly, the cameraman left his filming gear and called for help from the cliff, though the remote terrain kept rescue personnel from arriving for 45 minutes. Specialized cliff rescue units rappelled down the rock face, locating Elena's body on the jagged coastline below. She had suffered massive blunt force trauma from the approximately 120-foot fall, including skull fractures, spinal breaks, and internal organ rupture, with injuries described as non-survivable upon impact. The incident prompted immediate investigations into field reporting safety standards. Elena's family filed wrongful death lawsuits against the television network, citing inadequate safety protocols and reckless endangerment, ultimately reaching confidential settlements. It was September 9, 2015. The morning air in Łódź, Poland carried the familiar hum of industrial machinery as workers began their shifts at the city's largest textile manufacturing complex. What should have been a routine tour would become one of the most horrific industrial accidents ever broadcasted live. The tour was airing live on a business-focused television program, broadcast in real time from the factory floor. Piotr Lewandowski was a 38-year-old marketing consultant turned TV personality entrepreneur. Despite having no manufacturing experience beyond a few marketing contracts with industrial clients, he confidently featured factory tours as content that would demystify modern production for small business owners. Colleagues who knew him from his consulting days later described him as routinely dismissive of operational safety concerns. He'd convinced the factory management to allow filming during active production hours, arguing that authentic footage required real working conditions, a decision later cited as a policy exception and enforcement failure. Textile manufacturing involves massive looms operating at high speeds, with fabric moving through complex roller systems. Safety zones are clearly marked with yellow paint and warning signs, creating buffer areas around equipment that can catch loose clothing or body parts in milliseconds. Piotr had arranged to film during peak production hours, specifically for dramatic effect, dismissing the plant manager's suggestion to tour during maintenance periods. The factory supervisor had explicitly noted that lockout and tagout would not be performed, and access was visual only. But Piotr waved off the concerns, claiming his audience needed real industrial atmosphere. He wore a loose button-down shirt, despite being advised to change into fitted clothing, insisting his professional appearance was essential for credibility. Piotr positioned himself next to a massive industrial loom to explain fabric production speeds to viewers. Yellow warning lines clearly marked the danger zone around the machinery, but Piotr stepped beyond them to keep the equipment in frame behind him. His camera operator, a freelancer hired for the day, also crossed the line in violation of site rules, following his movements without questioning the positioning. The loom's massive rollers spun at full speed just 3 feet away, processing cotton fabric in continuous sheets. As Piotr gestured toward the machinery while speaking to his camera, his loose shirt sleeve brushed against the loom's intake roller. The fabric caught instantly, and in less than 1 second, the machinery pulled his entire arm into the mechanism. Piotr was yanked forward violently, his shoulder dislocated as parts of his torso twisted against the machine's frame. The camera fell to the concrete floor, but continued transmitting live, capturing audio of emergency alarms and machinery noise echoing across the factory floor. The live feed was cut moments later from the control room, as supervisors realized the severity of what viewers were witnessing. Workers reacted immediately, cutting power via the emergency controls, though the machinery's momentum kept it moving briefly. The supervisor dialed for help, and the paramedics arrived 15 minutes later. By then, Piotr had already sustained non-survivable injuries and was pronounced dead at the scene. The coroner's report determined death resulted from traumatic crush injuries and massive blood loss. The textile factory entered bankruptcy protection and later restructured following lawsuits, regulatory scrutiny, and sustained negative publicity after the incident. It was July 18, 2017. The medieval towers of Banska Štiavnica's historic castle complex cast long shadows across the cobblestone courtyard as afternoon tourists wandered through centuries-old corridors. Roman Hruška had discovered his passion for Slovak medieval history 3 years earlier. What began as weekend castle visits evolved into the 46-year-old's appearances on local TV and occasional regional broadcasts where he conducted walking tours for viewers across Europe. The segment that afternoon was airing live on regional television, broadcast in real time from the castle grounds. His insurance background gave him an eye for structural details, but his enthusiasm often overrode caution. Roman's signature move involved physically touching ancient walls and leaning against historical features to create intimate connections with the past for his audience. Medieval castles present unique hazards for modern visitors. Stone structures built centuries ago lack contemporary safety standards, with narrow passages, uneven surfaces, and deteriorating wooden elements that may appear solid, but are weakened over decades. That afternoon, Roman had convinced a security guard to allow him brief access to the castle's upper balcony, a section normally locked to public tours due to ongoing structural assessments. The wooden railing system dated to the 19th century and showed visible weathering, but Roman dismissed concerns as bureaucratic overcaution. He told his cameraman he wanted to show the panoramic view from the balcony's edge. Weather reports indicated recent heavy rains had saturated the region, potentially affecting wooden structures, but Roman and the crew were unaware of this. Roman positioned himself against the balcony's wooden railing, addressing his audience during a live broadcast while gesturing toward the courtyard below. He leaned backward against the barrier for dramatic effect, explaining the castle's defensive architecture to his engaged audience. The weathered railing fasteners began to pull free from their anchors under repeated pressure, creaking ominously. But Roman ignored the warning sounds, continuing his presentation while applying increasing force to the compromised railing system. And then, the wooden barrier gave way unevenly, the post pulling free from its anchors. Roman's full weight had been resting against the compromised railing when it failed, sending him tumbling backward into empty air, dropping nearly 40 feet. His body striking the stone courtyard with devastating force. Tourists in the courtyard screamed as Roman's chest hit the cobblestones first, followed by his head. The transmission ended abruptly moments later. A nearby tourist contacted emergency services, while onlookers remained with Roman until responders arrived. 12 minutes later, paramedics arrived and found that the injuries were fatal. The coroner's report determined Roman died from massive blunt force trauma. The castle immediately closed the upper sections for comprehensive structural review, discovering multiple areas with compromised wooden elements and conducting an investigation into the guard's temporary access decision. The investigation resulted in the guard being fired for granting access in violation of safety protocols. It was November 22nd, 2013. The morning air at Valparaiso's main shipyard carried the familiar scent of salt and diesel fuel, while workers made final preparations for the ceremonial launch of a 180-foot cargo vessel, unaware that the day's routine would become someone's last assignment. Diego Rojas, a 35-year-old correspondent, had built his reputation live covering Chile's maritime industry for 8 years. The launch coverage that morning was airing live on regional television, broadcast in real time from the shipyard. His colleagues at the television station respected his technical knowledge and fearless approach to getting dramatic footage. Diego specialized in maritime launches, understanding the complex engineering behind moving massive vessels from dry dock to water using gravity, grease, and precisely calculated momentum. Ship launches require vessels weighing hundreds of tons to slide down angled rails into water, with timing and positioning critical to prevent catastrophic accidents during the uncontrolled descent. Diego's confidence around ships had earned him exclusive access to restricted areas that other journalists couldn't reach. His editor had specifically requested close-up footage of the hull entering water for their evening maritime segment. Previous launches had made Diego somewhat complacent about safety protocols, often positioning himself closer to the action than harbor officials recommended. He'd covered dozens of similar ceremonies without incident, likely developing an almost casual attitude toward the inherent dangers. That morning, shipyard engineers had miscalculated the friction coefficients on the launching rails due to recent rainfall that had washed away protective grease. The 400-ton vessel was expected to descend at a controlled pace, but reduced friction caused it to accelerate far faster than engineers anticipated. Harbor officials issued standard safety warnings to media personnel, establishing a 50-foot exclusion zone around the launch area. Diego entered the exclusion zone against explicit warning. His cameraman later stated that Diego dismissed the precautions as overly conservative, having witnessed similar launches from closer distances. Once the blocks were released, no emergency mechanism could stop the vessel's momentum. Diego positioned himself directly between the concrete quay and the ship's hull, seeking dramatic angles that would capture the vessel's massive scale as it entered the water. His cameraman warned him about the tight space, but Diego insisted the footage would be worth the risk. At 11:45 in the morning, the ceremonial bottle broke against the bow, and workers released the restraining blocks. The ship began its descent faster than anyone anticipated. Within seconds, the accelerating hull pinned Diego against the concrete quay, compressing his torso under immense weight. His chest suffered massive compression, his ribcage crushed inward and internal organs severely damaged, while the hull continued its momentum for several seconds before settling into the water. Diego was incapacitated instantly. Survival under the 400-ton load was impossible. Workers at the shipyard called for help without delay, though paramedics arrived 12 minutes afterward to discover Diego had already died. The brief live broadcast later became crucial evidence in the subsequent safety investigation. The coroner determined multiple internal organs were severely damaged by the crushing force, consistent with unsurvivable injuries. The Maritime Authority conducted an investigation into how media personnel and Diego were allowed into the hazard area. Diego's funeral drew hundreds of dock workers and journalists who remembered his dedication to maritime reporting. It was March 4th, 2018. The afternoon heat in Kano's central marketplace pressed down on the crowded auction pavilion, where over 800 people had gathered for a live televised charity fundraiser. Sadiq Musa, a 42-year-old television host, had built his career hosting local fundraising programs for a regional television network, becoming beloved for his animated presentation style and genuine connection with audiences. His background as a former market trader gave him credibility with working-class viewers who trusted his authenticity. For 6 years, he'd specialized in live auction broadcasts that raised money for local schools and medical facilities. Live television auctions in crowded venues present unique challenges, requiring hosts to manage both broadcast timing and crowd dynamics while maintaining energy levels that keep viewers engaged and bidding active. The format demanded constant audience interaction, with hosts frequently moving through crowds to interview bidders and showcase auction items. The network was competing with newer digital platforms for advertising revenue, putting pressure on hosts to create more dynamic content. Sadiq often left the stage to work directly with audience members, a technique that boosted viewer engagement, but required him to navigate dense crowds without assigned security escorts, a practice noted by colleagues as unsafe. His fearless approach to crowd work had become his signature style. That afternoon, the auction pavilion was packed beyond its 600-person maximum capacity, with additional attendees standing in aisles and doorways. Local fire officials had issued warnings about overcrowding, but event organizers ignored maximum occupancy restrictions to maximize fundraising potential. The venue's emergency exits were partially blocked by vendor stalls, reducing evacuation routes. Sadiq noticed the cramped conditions but continued broadcasting, likely trusting that his experience managing crowds would prevent problems. At 3:20 in the afternoon, during a heated bidding sequence for donated livestock, a false report of a structural failure spread through the crowd. The false alarm triggered immediate panic as hundreds of people simultaneously rushed toward the limited exits. Sadiq attempted to restore calm while remaining live on television, but he was quickly pushed into the surging crowd and knocked down within seconds, rather than having the time to intervene safely. His cameramen continued filming from behind and alongside the host, capturing chaotic footage as the crowd surged, partially obscuring Sadiq from view. The crowd's surge pinned Sadiq to the concrete floor almost immediately. Witnesses later reported that he was knocked down and trapped under the surge within seconds, as the crowd surged forward, compressing him against the concrete floor and surrounding bodies. Emergency services were summoned at once by personnel, but ambulances were delayed 18 minutes in reaching the scene because of panicked crowds and obstructed access. Paramedics transported Sadiq to the local hospital, where he was pronounced dead shortly after arrival, despite aggressive resuscitation attempts. The coroner determined Sadiq died from compressive asphyxia and multiple blunt force injuries. Sadiq was one of 7 people killed in the stampede, with over 60 others hospitalized for crush injuries. Subsequent investigations highlighted that overcrowding, blocked exits, and lack of on-site security directly contributed to the fatalities, leading to new regulations requiring mandatory crowd control measures and security escorts for television hosts working in dense public gatherings. Thanks for watching. If you liked these stories, click here.